I'm sorely tempted to slip him a note to say what women want in the budget. Because as in 2015, 2016, my gender has been conspicuously ignored and marginalized. There has been a movement toward gender equality, and yes, Guyana too should and must move in that direction, but on the presumption that tangible women's empowerment will not be neglected. The 230 billion budget 2016 has failed to deliver transformative initiatives which will impact on women's financial enablement and skills development, and has not offered a plan for structural support for women in the throes of domestic violence or to those struggling to survive and provide as single mothers. Cosmetic mergers of the Women's Affairs Bureau, which exists, and the Men's Affairs Bureau, which exists, and a new gender policy will not address in a concrete way the fact that women are still at the bottom of the ladder of earning, and they still are in a patriarchal society. To ensure the efficacy of the promised Gender Affairs Bureau, there must be effective mechanisms for the review and monitoring of sectoral policies and a healthy, inclusive discussion on the strengths and weaknesses and steps to improve its output. We cannot talk of women's equality in Guyana and not address the worrying problem of domestic violence. It seems under this APNU AFC administration, domestic violence has been relegated to the back burner. An honorable member on the government side sought to lecture us on the abuse of women during this debate. The irony and shame of it is that not one woman on that side of the House, none of my colleagues on that side of the House in Parliament, chastised sitting members in this assembly and in government when sexist and offensive remarks were directed against me. Mr. Speaker, then the Honourable Minister gets up and will get up and talk about plans for women and gender equality. I would like to say to the Honourable Minister that it starts with you. On another note, we have heard of many persons being pardoned and set free. Were there any females who were pardoned? Yes, they're female prisoners. Absolutely not. Has any attention been paid to their appalling conditions in the prison? No, not in this budget. Mr. Speaker, this is the insincerity that looms large in the face of grand announcements of gender equality. Does the 2016 budget address women's wages, their unpaid work burden, and labor in the informal sector? Is there any interest in this data collection which will guide policies towards decreasing the inequity which exists in the working world with regard to wages? What about employment opportunities for women? It is a fact that women predominate as low-paid workers, domestic workers, and in many jobs which are non-unionized, non-regulated or unregulated, and not subject to minimum wage. I suppose I should not expect better from the current government. There is an overdose of geriatrics or a geriatric overdose, whichever way you want to take it. Gender imbalance is a hallmark. 4 vice presidents and not 1 woman. Few women head their ministries. They're stuck in some junior positions. Even fewer women are in an advisory capacity. More geriatrics, lots of military men too. But then, Mr. Speaker, maybe you have to be past the age of retirement to be considered. So much for the youth, honorable colleague. Ghana Women's Leadership Institute, established under the PPPC, caters for the elevation of women, grassroots women, to prepare them for leadership in this country. In the last 6 months, this institute has been starved of new initiatives, starved of evolving programs to cater for the current needs of women. Yes, the PPPC had many imaginative programs, but time is moving on. You can't be stuck in a time warp. Mr. Speaker, when time marches on, there are advances and the needs of women constantly evolve. This is the institute which annually churns out hundreds of graduates of women every year. What happened in the last 6 months? In fact, our very own MP, Honourable Gillian Burton, is a graduate from the first batch of that institute. I'm urging the Honourable Minister, Mr. Speaker, not to be stuck in a time warp, to consult. While we are very happy that many of the PPPC programs are being taken on board, and I'll tell you about that in a bit, we need to be imaginative, innovative, and visionary in planning for the future. What about the entrepreneurial programs, like the popular Christmas comedian? I have to ask, like the popular Christmas comedian, Mr. Speaker, I have to ask, I wonder what happened to the Women of Worth program. Word has it that it will be genderized. The whole point of that program was that it provided opportunities for women, single women who did not have the same as those of their male counterparts. Single mothers struggling to provide for their families, bright and resourceful women who were unable to source loans. We recognize, as the PPC government, that it was not a level playing field. It still is not a level playing field, so be careful. Mr. Speaker, over $35 million were unspent from last year's budget, and that tells the story that not enough was done through ministry when so much screams for attention. Mr. Speaker, what are the provisions in the budget for women whose husbands are going to lose their jobs in the sugar industry? At least 50 employees lost their jobs at the Iflet estate this week. In fact, women were told at that estate, if you want to stay in our employ, cut and stop canes. A callous and a high-handed approach. I dare not say duplicitous, Mr. Speaker, but if the workers were assured that they would not be knocked off, and then they were, what other word should I say, Mr. Speaker? Really, the stench of unemployment threatens to lend to more social problems for women who are primary dependents. Is the budget for difficult circumstances expansive enough to withstand the needs which will arise from these situations? Will these women be able to benefit when their tables are empty and their children cannot go to school? Mr. Speaker, I have not heard that the Bees project, books, buses, bicycles, breakfast, that those projects have been allocated to the Iflot and the Wales estate area. I have always championed the rights of women and men long before I entered the political arena. I am happy that children are not going hungry. I am happy that children are getting books. I am even happier that children are getting transportation. But Mr. Speaker, my question is, when the donors' money runs out, who will sustain this? Who decides? Who decides where these buses are placed? What studies were done to determine which are the poorest communities and which communities have the most need, Mr. Speaker? I would like to highlight the sheer inadequacy of the buses that are being, gifted from the government side, and question the manner in which benefits have been accrued. How many children actually benefit from this bus system? Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, when we had the Because We Care project, the $10,000 benefited every child. Not in some areas. It was not done at the whims and fancy of anyone. It was done for all Guyanese children. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to tread carefully on the next one. There's been much issue about colors. since I was a child, and any child who knows their colors of the flag, there are 5 colors. The colors of the flag, if you're asked in school, you cannot only say green and yellow. The haircloth, black and white and red must be mentioned, Mr. Speaker. But I cannot help if colleagues are colorblind, but I can say I'm willing to offer consultation in the face of uncontrollable and pervasive instances of suicide, violence, alcohol abuse. People are additionally consumed by the sheer fear for their lives in heightened crime environments, Mr. Karma, uncertainty about their future in jobs as they are fired, they're replaced, they're demoted, they're subsumed in ministries and others placed over their heads, wherein they were heads of departments. Mr. Speaker, people in the public sector are being frustrated. A budget that imposes draconian measures that hurts the pockets, the food table, and the quality of life is no budget for the ordinary person, the poor person, nor the working person. We suffer from the consequences of alcohol abuse. In most aspects of life, accidents, suicides, violence, death, decrease in productivity. Why would taxes on alcohol be reduced? Are we nurturing a drinking overdrive or a drinking culture which has hurt us and continue to hurt us? Maybe karma will tell us. Why not instead spend on alcohol and other drugs and substances, abuse rehabilitation programs, creating support groups for alcoholics and their families? Mr. Speaker, what kind of government imposes 100% and more increases on vital license, and then on the other hand, or at the same time, they're dragging out negotiations which will give increases to workers, which will increase their salary? And you know what? I want to bet you, I want to bet all of you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, let me make it easier and remind this government of the promised 10%, which we get to see. I hope the negotiations yield more, as that was the APNU AFC's proposal on the campaign trail. And recently, how can the proposed measures of this budget, which were well ventilated, be acceptable to anyone without evidence-based studies to show their merits or their contribution to improvement in finances and quality of life across the board? The APNU AFC government has reneged on most of its manifesto promises. Let me list them for you, Mr. Speaker. $20,000 old age pension, the decrease in VAT, the 10% salary increase. I am pretty sure that nothing more than 5% or 7% is coming the workers' way. And furthermore, it might not even be retroactive from January 2016. I hope my words will influence it otherwise, Mr. Speaker. I say to the unions, press on, ask for 10% or more for the workers. And I say to the workers, hold this government accountable. Every year, persons expectantly await a people-oriented budget to provide relief to their pockets through more disposable income, which ultimately contributes to the local and national economy. By having money circulating at all levels, with disposable income, money moves from the seamstress, the bookseller, the shopkeeper, to the higher levels in the business sector. But Budget 2016 is a damp squib, which has once again failed the people of Guyana. Poverty alleviation is a Millennium Development Goal. With the incurred increases in the cost of living, that goal has all but faded into oblivion. If we are to alleviate poverty among women, Mr. Speaker, there ought to be enhanced awareness of women's rights and provisions under these rights. For example, pregnant women, the antenatal and maternity benefits. While you might invoke the Anti-Discrimination Act, but are these embedded in our policies? Do all women benefit across the board? Amendment of legislation, cater for women who do not work outside their homes, legislation on sexual harassment and stalking, knowledge of gender issues through the society. That's what I want to see happening in the Ministry of Social Protection. Women work long hours, both as primary and secondary income earners, at the expense of their health and at the expense where their children and families may be neglected. Mr. Speaker, I would have been heartened to hear initiatives to remove some of the burdens of our women, including minimal cost daycare facilities for parents, special programs for teenage mothers, parenting programs, support programs for widows, survivors of trauma, violence and abuse. I know some of this exists, but I want to see more done in all of this. At the end of the day, women represent 50% of our country's population, Mr. Speaker, and investing in women's capability and empowering them to exercise their choices contributes to economic growth, overall development, and the future financial status of their children. Because it is well known, Mr. Speaker, that children mirror their mother's financial status rather than those of their father. But, Mr. Speaker, this is what confounded me most in this budget debate 2016, when the two finance ministers conflicted markedly on the financial state of the country and the consolidated fund during budget debate 2016. It is cause not only for concern but serious worry, Mr. Speaker. On one hand, our Honourable Finance Minister presents a $230 billion budget and had the wherewithal shortly after the current government assumed office to dispense large increases to government ministers' salaries, the largest cabinet in the Caribbean, to increase significantly the numbers of contract workers, to pay super salaries to a slew of advisors, and to give to projects being embarked on with little details, notably the project in Durban Park. Mr. Speaker, I don't have a problem with projects, but I want to know what's happening. I want some accountability. Mr. Speaker, look at that picture. On the other hand, the junior finance minister claims that the consolidated fund was in overdraft, which means that there was no money in 2015. Ooh, Mr. Speaker, that's a lot of confusion in one place. Budget 2016 has no new initiatives, nothing to cushion the hardships faced by the ordinary man. Rather, it has added to the vicissitudes of that persons deal with on a daily basis. In fact, which is wide-reaching ambit, the Ministry of Social Protection, which focuses on our most vulnerable and family welfare, deserves more than a $3 billion increase from 2014. In fact, the Office of the Prime Minister receives double, and we're all confused as to what really is falling under the purview of the Prime Minister's office. Not only we, everyone is. Could not the Ministry of Social Protection receive more than the $13 billion allocated to deliver some of the projects that are so badly needed to combat the social ills of this country, Mr. Speaker? To increase the human resource pool in all the regions of our country, to ensure our homeless is not treated in such an inhumane manner that water douses them in the middle of their sleep. Oh my God, I could not believe this. The homeless people need to be treated with dignity, not because them na got, them na matter. They're people, Guyanese people. I would like to quote the Honourable Minister Lawrence, who spoke of the beginning of the year to Kaichur News. I quote, "The Ministry of Social Protection wants to run with its programs, but we are hamstrung by staff shortage in the Labour Department, staff shortage in the Accounts Department, staff shortage in the Childcare and Protection Agency, a perennial shortage of funding to monetize initiatives leave us in some doubt as to how we are going to achieve our goals." I know that the Honourable Minister understands the need to have a larger cut of the pie. I know that. And she wants that to offer services effectively to those who require it, victims of domestic violence, pensioners, single parents. Mr. Speaker, we do not wield the proverbial scissors. Instead, I ask for more for the Ministry of Social Protection. I ask for more Ministry of Social Protection so that more can be done for all Guyanese. Over 3,000 reports of child abuse have been recorded at the Child Care and Protection Agency in the course of 2015. According to the head of that agency, neglect ranked highest, while sexual abuse reports exceeded the 600 mark. Throughout 2015, CPA, or Child Care and Protection Agency, had to find alternative care for over 500 children. That entity has suffered from a dearth of trained professionals, and I see little provision made for the employment of child psychologists, social workers, and counselors. In fact, I've seen people being fired in an entity that has a shortage. Mr. Speaker, policies and programs will not be executed without requisite human resources, capacity to efficiently and competently execute a mandate. In Region 6, for example, one social worker, and I know, Region 6, for example, one social worker is assigned to many shelters whose children residing in there their lives have been scarred by abuse. And of course, it is a logistical and administrative nightmare. I would like to see the social services or the social protection ministry. I can't keep track of all these name changes. And on the subject of name changes, Mr. Speaker, I'm really sorry for the grade 6 pupils. Between remembering the ministers and all the new names, God help them. I would like to see the social protection ministry developing parenting programs to prevent or curb the issue of child abuse. While an awareness program is on the cards, prevention must be parallel. Rehabilitation of the abusive family members is also key for reintegration to be successful. Mr. Speaker, the policies and programs mentioned on pages 60 to 61 of the budget speech with regard to the Ministry of Social Protections as spanking new initiatives leave me puzzled, as the programs mentioned therein, notably National Early Childhood Development Sensitization Program, form part of the programs begun under the PPPC in 2012 in collaboration with UNICEF toward the advancement of the Millennium Development Goals. And let's talk about the family court. The existing counter trafficking in persons unit. Those things are not new things. Where's the new in your budget, Madam Minister? I'm happy that pensioners can look forward to a book to cover their calendar year and the electronic system in the future, as the $18,200 given in this budget, a paltry $1,200 increase in the face of lost electricity and water subvention, has thrown many pensions in disarray, as in their twilight years they're struggling to eke out of that sum payments towards light, water, food, rent, and even medications. Mr. Speaker, not me. Let me read. Over $600 million returned to the Treasury as hospitals face drug shortage. And further, let's talk about GPHC having critical drug shortage, and we talk about alienating drug providers and all of these things. The problem is there is a shortage. Pensioners have to pay over $20,000 outside of the public sector to get medication, and they suffer from many chronic illnesses. Diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, not to mention they have to get tests like lipid profile, which cost somewhere in the vicinity of $10,000 to $12,000. How are they going to live on this? $18,200? Mr. Speaker, I forgot, members of this assembly, pensioners are to get an additional benefit out of that money, but before they get that benefit, they got to buy a big fancy ticket out of the country to get the free airport tax. Yeah. And then they have to buy new tires and a new car to benefit from the free driver's license. Mr. Speaker, tell me again, how many pensioners are going to benefit from those two measures? I want to know. The pensioners want to know. I hope the Honourable Minister will answer all of these questions and the many that I have for her on the estimates. Like many of my colleagues, I'm still waiting on some of the answers from last year's budget's estimates. There are many questions posed every year, and a lot of us are waiting on those answers. In this House, where accountability and transparency are important, we need answers. Did I mention that gas prices only went down by $20, Mr. Speaker? So add transportation to the pensioners list. Transportation cost has gone up. And then with people having to pay for their minibuses on every trip and all of that, imagine what happens to the pensioner. Mr. Speaker, in summary, the direct dollar value of the pension will be eroded by the increase in the cost of living.
Honourable Member, you have 5 minutes remaining.
The differently able will once again... Sorry.
Mr. Speaker, if you would allow me, could I please ask for the honourable members further extension of 5 minutes as agreed? Thank you.
Yeah.
I thank the Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You now have 35 minutes.
Thank you so much.
A total of 35 minutes.
The differently able will not once again benefit in any tangible way. Yes, they will get a book for 1 year, but imagine if their increase is only $800, that could have been used up in the transportation money just to go to collect the money allotted to them. Mr. Speaker, I'm not here to score cheap political points by highlighting glaring inadequacies of the budget, but to look at this budget against the real scenario that exists in Guyana today, namely unparalleled number of suicides, repossession of homes and lands because people cannot afford to meet the payments, or access loans. And now with this budget, there is a decrease in disposable income. It's not a laughing matter, colleagues. Reduction of security of the family due to job loss and tenuousness in jobs of the breadwinners of the home. Reduction of security, I'll get to that. Crippling of the major economic generating industries, rice and sugar, with no transition plans to prepare the farmers for the future, nor to withstand economic crisis, nor natural disasters like drought. The farmers have been talking to me, Mr. Speaker. The waters are not getting to their land. Upper Quarantine, Central Quarantine, West Coast Demerara. Spiraling violence, abuse, and other crimes against women and children, poor investment, and low employment opportunities. I'm not saying some of these things did not exist. I'm talking about now. You're in the seat. You're in the seat. It's yours to deal with. A stagnant economy with businesses in crises, drug and alcohol abuse fueling crime, accidents, and loss of productivity. Thank you for your protection, Mr. Speaker. Rampant loss of lives and property, murders, Mr. Speaker, of men, women, and youth in callous and brutal attacks by bandits. Recently, a woman, recently a young boy, a member of the Hare Krishna movement who was just going home from worship. Mr. Speaker, like Nero, the Minister of Public Service, a self-appointed religious pontiff, pontificates on Hinduism and now karma, and engages in debates on dates. Where are the Honourable Minister's priorities, Mr. Speaker? People are dying, blood is being shed, and yet this self-appointed Pope and Pontiff meddles with deeds. Against this, I say Budget 2016 has failed us all. You, me, the people who depend on us, for it to make a positive impact on their life. How can people feel protected and cared for if they are marginalized and displaced, Mr. Speaker? A country's well-being is centered on boosting the morale of all its citizens, enabling them to unleash their capacity for an optimum level of productivity for the benefit of their country. This hinges on citizens being able to enjoy the fruits of their labor through personal financial stability, security of family, job and environment, equality of opportunity in all spheres, and for all ages, genders, ethnicities, and yes, even political persuasions. Mr. Speaker, a climate of fear, uncertainty, hopelessness stalks Guyana, a country which clawed its way from bankruptcy under the stewardship of the PPP to to where persons were able to own homes, cars, enjoy the profits from an expanding economy, where groundbreaking policies and programs brought vulnerable groups and their circumstances to the forefront, where young people studied and stayed. They're not staying now, Mr. Speaker. Where people saw their dreams, small dreams, turn into big realities, where children of cane cutters became professionals, where love for the soil engendered booming agricultural returns, where people were empowered to study, work, and have ambitions which were realized. And there was recognition of the indigenous people, their rights and contributions, and our religious, cultural, and freedoms were not tampered with. Mr. Speaker, as I conclude, I want to say this. As we approach our 50th independence anniversary, I am proud of our collective struggles and our histories as we fought to achieve independence. But I'm deeply saddened by the ugly monsters which continue to rear their heads in our midst. Party primacy, party paramountcy, and political partisanship.
You have 5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the government has been vociferous in voicing its commitment to social cohesion, Mr. Speaker, it has demonstrated through its actions of giving primarily to its political support base while starving the bases which support the PPPC, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to respond to some of the comments made by my colleague, the Honourable Mr. Kathy Hughes. What are you talking about when you mention the word scam for 23 years? I have elaborated in detail that people were able to own, people were able to live, and people were able to attain. When we talk about not renewing contracts, is this a blanket approach? Is this to drive more fear in the minds of people who are sitting in jobs, to tell them that soon they will be on the breadline? We are talking about ICT as if it is the most recent discovery in our life. Mr. Speaker, in our manifesto, in our budgets, ICT hubs, ICT parks, ICT connectivity, ICT for the indigenous community, ICT, ICT, ICT was coming out of the PPPC's benches. In fact, from since 2009, this was talked about by the PPPC. When we talk about interconnectivity, it is from these benches that e-governance was spoken about. It is from these benches that we talked about virtual classrooms, virtual consultations. Mr. Speaker, when we want to talk new and groundbreaking, let us be factual. Mr. Speaker, on the issue of tourism, I would like Guyana to be a destination for all. I was born here, raised here, educated here, I work here. I now represent my people here. This is home.
You have 3 minutes.
I am distraught when I hear people speaking ill about their country, and now when you're in the seat of power, suddenly it's a reversal. The headline screamed with what you said to deter people from coming to this country. Mr. Speaker, again, I don't want to be unparliamentary. The other thing about tourism, Mr. Speaker, hospitality needs to improve. I agree. The hospitality school is not new. Again, in the budget before. And finally, if we are going to attract tourists, we need to keep them safe. They're going to go to the markets, and people are being robbed every day in the markets. And they're not only being robbed, they're being stabbed. It is not karma, Mr. Speaker. I know the meaning of karma. But I leave it to His Holiness to decide what it means to him. Mr. Speaker, this political partisanship and paramountcy is a subject that very few want to talk about or confront. Yet it lies here festering. Look at where lights are placed, who jobs are given to and taken from. When will we see ourselves as Guyanese first and only that? A government must be for all Guyana, every Guyanese, each one, regardless of their political persuasion or any other distinction or difference. Everyone deserves equal opportunity and benefits. Mr. Speaker,
you have 1 minute remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we need to eradicate this ugly constant from every facet of our lives if we are to foster national pride. trust and fraternity, and truly understand and appreciate and celebrate 50 years in Guyana without it becoming a meaningless $300 million exercise. Mr. Speaker, I can't support this budget presented by the Honourable Minister of Finance unless he rectifies it to cater for all Guyanese and all of Guyana. Thank you.